Welcome to this Julius Baer webcast, the Coral Reef Economy Financing the Future. We're broadcasting live from the UN Climate Change COP26 in Glasgow, and we're really happy to have you here. Coral reefs are the rainforests of the ocean. They are valued at billions of dollars a year, and over 500 million people live off of them for their livelihoods. But of course, they're invaluable to all of us, given that they're gorgeous and biodiverse and beautiful, and half the oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. Today we have three wonderful experts. One is a climate change scientist, another is a coral farmer, and a third is a finance guru. And we're eager to talk to them, but first, I'd like to introduce you to Yvonne Sutter, who's the head of sustainability and director of the Sustainability Board for Julius Baer. Yvonne.
Thanks, Christine, and hello, everybody. On behalf of Julius Baer, a very warm welcome to the COP26 special webcast on coral reef economy. We all hear it these days, how science proves that climate change is one of the most pressing global challenges we need to address. The IPCC report, the climate report, tells us that climate change has accelerated at the rate that threatens the long-term future of our humanity, and it also has significant short-term implication on our well-being. The world, as we know, has to move away from the business-as-usual behavior. We have to reduce the current rate of damage. So energy, transport, industry, buildings, food production, food consumption, these are all sectors that play a crucial role in addressing climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And actually the preservation of the natural world plays one of the most critical role in addressing climate change. It is a really critical lever to slowing and reversing climate change. And it is also one of the most efficient and effective solutions we have these days. So we need to prioritize the protection of our nature. And in this context, at Julius Baer, we have defined two key topics. One is addressing the underuse of human resources. The other one is addressing the overuse of natural resources. So addressing the overuse of natural resources is what we will focus on today. It has become evident that we need actually to use maritime resources more responsibly in order to protect the ocean and herewith also the livelihoods and the economies that rely on it. And consequently, what we can see is that more and more investors are aware of this need. More and more investors actually want to go beyond just achieving financial returns and risk mitigation. They want to use their capital to positively contribute in addressing climate change and protecting the ocean in particular. Of course, the ocean is only one example, but it is a crucially and important one. So did you know, for instance, that the ocean generates 50% of the oxygen we breathe? So in many respects, we are only at the beginning and we have to move fast. At Julius Baer, we are here to accompany you on your way and in the transition towards a more sustainable and equitable world. And reflecting our commitment to this transition, I'm very delighted to announce today the launch of the Julius Baer Sustainability Circle. The Julius Baer Sustainability Circle is an exclusive and global community of Julius Baer clients, with the aim to bring together entrepreneurs, philanthropists, investors, business leaders in the shared desire to make a positive impact on the environment and on the society. So stay tuned, there is more to come. And with that, I'm really looking forward now to dive into the coral reef economy. We are very excited that we have the opportunity to host this discussion with experts, leading experts in the field of coral reef economy. So many thanks, and back to you, Christine.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you for your leadership. I'd like to introduce someone who's an expert in coral reefs, a climate scientist and a professor from Australia. His name is Ove Goldberg from University of Queensland, from the Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. And importantly, he's also a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Ove?
Thanks very much, Kristen. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. And it's really a great privilege, I think, to be in these discussions because they're so important. As Kristen said, I'm a professor at the University of Queensland, and I've been studying marine science and climate change for the past 35 years. Now, if you were to view our planet from space, you might feel that there wasn't very many, that the coral reefs were a pretty minor part of the planet. Because of the surface area occupied by coral reefs, it's only 0.1% of the total sea floor. Now, that's pretty misleading because in that 0.1% of the seafloor, there is possibly as many as 1 million species that live in and around coral reefs, mangroves, and other tropical ecosystems. And in fact, 1 in every 4 species lives in association with coral reefs. So it's really an amazing sort of resource. And in terms of the blue economy, next slide, coral reefs really are hitting above their average. In terms of food, they are responsible for supporting as many as 500 million people. They're incredibly important in the stability of coastlines and working together with mangroves in terms of climate regulation. They're also really important in terms of protecting people and communities from the power of waves in the ocean. Often the first line of defense is a coral reef. Livelihoods, cultural, and of course, even biodiscovery. Of those 1 million species, many of them have yielded really valuable sort of biomedical and pharmaceutical products. And in terms of the sort of blue economy, it's very clear that how you treat this system is really incredibly important in terms of whether it can then deliver all these benefits. And we did this study some years ago with the Boston Consulting Group, where we estimated the sort of assets of the ocean and how much that was paying in terms of a dividend, and what part of that were coral reefs. And in fact, coral reefs represented $300 to $400 billion each year in terms of sort of benefits, largely renewable if you took care of the system. But of course, we don't always have that in mind. In a study that was done some years ago now, it was found that even in really pristine areas, we were losing corals. And so in this graphic here, where you've got the sort of 4 arrows, these are 4 independent studies that were done where you looked at the literature and understood how much change was going on. And the average was somewhere around sort of 50% over the last 30 years. And that's a huge number for an ecosystem as important as coral reefs. More recently, we've had estimates coming from the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, which is where countries have banded together to sort of look at these resources and the state of their repair, and found that since 2009, we've lost another 14% of corals. And this originally started with things like pollution, overfishing, physical destruction along unsustainably managed coastlines. But more recently, there is climate signal, ocean warming, powerful storms, ocean acidification have been coming onto the landscape. And then when we look at the last 5 years, we've seen 3 record underwater heating events that have had huge impacts on shallow water corals, not only on the Great Barrier Reef, but many other parts of the world. And when you look at the sort of severity of these events, which are record underwater heat waves essentially, you see coral communities becoming white and dying in great numbers. Now, one of the sobering aspects of this problem is the fact that all of the evidence, multiple lines of evidence, is suggesting that corals will be in very big disrepair. In fact, if we don't do anything today, we will lose them by 2100. But what's incredibly sobering is the fact that even if we hit the Paris Climate Agreement of well below 2 degrees and hopefully long-term 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial, we still lose 70 to 90% of today's corals by 2100. For many people, this could be very disheartening. You know, we're too late, it's time to give up. But in fact, I think this is the case of a classic case of the glass being half full as opposed to being seen as half empty. And I think when we put that type of thinking together alongside some breakthroughs in the scientific literature, we actually have a plan for saving coral reefs into the future. In a number of studies, refugia have been identified. There are parts of the ocean where there are trends in storms, where storms are getting less frequent, less powerful. There are many parts of the ocean that are heating up at slower rates of heating as opposed to the global average. And so there's this real distinct possibility that these refugia may be what we need to start to focus on. And that's in fact what we've done. And so the proposition is really quite simple. What if we were to identify where the least exposed coral reefs were and move to protect them from non-climate change stresses such as pollution and overfishing? This might actually be the sort of thing that we need to do, because there's no doubt about the fact that we need to flatten our emissions and get them to zero as quickly as possible. But in the meantime, we should also be protecting the sort of corals that are likely to be around to regenerate reefs into the future. And it's that 10 to 30% that are in these low exposed regions that are becoming really interesting and important. And so the strategy is really quite simple. Step one is aggressive mitigation of greenhouse gases. Next slide. And two is to then identify and protect those key regeneration sites that are likely to survive climate change. How do we choose these sites? Well, we went through a process of bringing together 30 or so preeminent sort of research scientists from oceanography to genetics to larval connectivity, and came up with a series of indicators that would indicate whether or not you're exposed to climate change or not. And then using some clever thinking with respect to modern portfolio theory, ending up getting a portfolio of 50 reefs which had good chances of surviving. And so if you look at this diagram here, you can see that the green and blue areas are areas where you have the least exposure to climate change. But there are clearly other areas such as northern Philippines and the central and northern Pacific where reefs are heating up at much faster rates than average. So it's about identifying those blue and green sites, clumping them into manageable sort of units, and then picking the sort of 50 best to put into this conservation plan. Next slide. We've written this up in a number of articles. It's been accepted by the scientific community. Lots of debate, of course. We don't want to be seen as cutting some reefs loose and others being protected. But this is a global strategy about how do we deal with the fact that we will have dwindling coral reef resources almost certainly by mid-century, even after we have brought emissions to net zero. So it's a really sort of it's a solution to how we include climate change in the thinking of preserving reefs for the future. And this is a slide which sort of is conservation for coral reefs on a single page. On the right-hand side, you've got the 50 reef sites that have the lowest exposure to climate change and are well connected into other reef systems so that when they recover, they will have a strong influence on other coral reefs around them. And on the left-hand side, we've got this opportunity where we've got a lot of local factors that threaten reefs, which we can actually deal with. And so identifying these reefs that are least susceptible to climate change, and then dealing with those non-climate change stresses becomes the sort of core of the strategy. And this has led to a coral reef program called the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative, which has identified that 70% of the high-performing reefs that have the lowest exposure to climate change and greatest connectivity are found in 7 countries. And so we've engaged with those countries, along with a number of our NGO brethren, and we've started a program which is now, has identified those sites, is now engaging on the ground with the sort of problems that people are facing in terms of local stresses, And hopefully with this type of partnership, and we're certainly growing this partnership, the more people, the merrier. We really think we can scale up and have a really big impact on this incredibly beautiful and valuable ecosystem. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ove. So it sounds like we have a lot less harm to be doing, and we also need to be regenerating. So less harm on one side with climate change and pollution, and also much more restoration and regeneration. How do we do that? What are some of the techniques we can use to get there?
Well, I think it's really important. There's no one sort of silver bullet here. We really have to find that hail of bullets to deal with the multiple stresses that reefs face. But if you were to sort of look around the world and look at that sort of non-climate change factor that is really serious and needs to be dealt with, it's water quality. If you look at the destabilization of tropical catchments, forest catchments, the agrochemicals flowing off land, all of these threats are going up over time. And it's become really critical that we start to deal with it. And we've already identified in the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative that we need to be looking at some of these catchment areas at agriculture, sugarcane, the deforestation that goes on in many places. And then many of the countries that we're looking at are facing this problem. Of course, there are other major issues. Fishing needs to be, most fisheries are in disrepair. We've got to sort of make some really big inroads into sort of how do we control fishing. People have to catch and eat fish, but how do we sort of do that in a way where, as one NGO says, you can fish forever, right? That's right. Sustainability, and that's why we've got to sort of look at this problem from many angles. But that's the one that we're looking at very closely, the sedimentation and nutrients and fertilizer problem.
Great. So hopefully the negotiations this week go really well, and there's a decrease in carbon and some agreements to really hitting that 1.5 degrees C, right? And also less fishing pressure, less nutrient runoff from coastal regions and things like that. Oh, we have an interesting anecdote, don't we, from our friends from National Geographic's Pristine Seas. They just returned from a trip in the Kiribati. I think you and I might know where that is, but in this first slide, it shows just how in the middle of the ocean it is, a country the size of the United States. And the team went back to the Southern Line Islands. It's very, very east of Australia and very, very west of North America, as you can see, about 4 days by boat from Tahiti. And on to the next slide. We were there in 2009 on a Pristine Seas expedition to monitor what was going on with those reefs that are very, very far away from human impact, but of course, climate change affects everywhere. And unfortunately, even though the place did get protected a few years later, next slide, it was hit by a warming event, which is natural but catalyzed quicker through climate change. So in 2016, half the reefs died. And the expedition team this year really didn't know what they would find when they returned to this reef. And if you can go to the next slide, we were thrilled that it was healthy and had regenerated inside the protected areas versus outside where there was still a lot of fishing. So to Ove's point, the less stressors we have, the better these places do and the quicker they can heal. So we were really, really happy with this news that there's baby corals that are regrowing to the tune of 17 million per square kilometer, which was really, really great to see. If you go to the next slide, bountiful fish can live off these reefs, keep everything clean. And next slide, these guys, the parrotfish, go ahead and clean the coral. So this is how these ecosystems work in the basic ways of all these players doing their job, living in their home with their families, and it's a really healthy ecosystem. Oh, what do you think?
Well, I think you've made some really good points there, and one that I think is really important in this whole business is that if with a little bit of help, corals can bounce back very quickly. And so quite often, you'll go to a reef 1 year and then 5 years later you go back and it has bounced back. But it's the timing between the disruption, the underwater bleaching events or cyclone impacts. If they're apart enough for coral reefs to sort of recover, coral reefs will recover. But what we're seeing is this gradually shortening of that period. And that's what has a lot of people worried. But of course, if we can do this as a planet, And Glasgow has got so much hope. If we can get to sort of net zero as soon as possible and stabilize sea temperatures and so on, I think we're going to see much more of the sort of explosive regrowth as opposed to the very depressing things that people have been seeing over the last few years. So it's so uplifting though, isn't it? To go and dive on a reef like that and those beautiful acanthurids and I've been in lockdown here too long.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us, Ove. We really appreciate all of your expertise and all the work you've been doing to help reverse the degradation of climate change on coral reefs. Thank you.
It's been my great pleasure, Kristen.
We're lucky to have with us today Sam Teicher of Coral Vita. He is Chief Reef Officer and Managing Director and a recent winner of the Earthshot Prize. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. It's good to see you.
Congratulations on Earthshot being one of the winners.
Really appreciate it. It's absolutely incredible, to say the least.
That's so great. So tell us about Coral Vita. Where are you heading next?
So we're in the Bahamas right now, and eventually we want to launch large-scale coral farms in every nation with reefs around the world. That's the big picture vision. So we're a mission-driven company that grows corals to restore dying reefs using breakthrough methods developed by amazing coral scientists together with an innovative business model to unlock funding for large-scale reef restoration. And our company's been in existence for a few years. Now with the Earthshot Prize, things might be picking up a little bit quicker than we had originally anticipated, but we're here to try and ensure that there are coral reefs for future generations.
Very cool. So there's, I think, a few innovations we can talk about. One is the actual science of the corals itself in your model. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are methods that have been around for decades where you can grow corals to put them back into reefs to revitalize their health. It's in some ways akin to reforestation. You can take cuttings of living corals and almost graft them onto reefs after they've grown. There's also ways that you can sort of breed corals together, almost again akin to pollination. What we're doing is using methods, one of which was pioneered by Dr. David Vaughan of Plant-A-Million Corals, where you can grow corals in months instead of decades. That's known as microfragmenting, as well as other methods pioneered by Dr. Ruth Gates, formerly our advisor before she passed away, and her partners to strengthen corals' resilience to climate change threats, so assist evolution. On a simple level, if you look at one piece of coral, coral's an animal, and it's a colony of different clones all together. If you cut up one of those pieces into tiny little microfragments, place them near each other, almost like our scar tissue, they'll fuse back together because some corals, while they can grow very fast from the size of your thumb to your hand and wrist in 6 to 12 months, others take decades, if not centuries, in nature to reach that size. We can now grow those corals in months and years instead of decades and centuries.
That's cool. Very cool and very important to meet the urgency of our time. What about your business model? How is that different and what are you thinking about to get to scale?
I've been a diver since I was 13 years old. I love the ocean, as does my co-founder Gator and our whole team. So we're corally rooted in the mission. Unfortunately, as we've seen, not enough people protect the environment and nature for its own sake, and often also don't realize how much we as humanity, let alone biodiversity, depend on it for all of its countless economic benefits. And so if you look at one ecosystem, coral reefs, they take up less than 1% of the seafloor. They sustain the livelihoods of up to 1 billion people in over 100 countries and territories, 25% of marine life, and the latest estimate had them having an annual goods and services of $2.7 trillion.
Wow.
Half of reefs are dead, over 90% are on track to die by 2050. All that value is at risk. So our thought, looking at how coral farming's been done by amazing NGOs and scientists around the world for years, but has often been roadblocked by lack of funding, among other things. Let's sell reef restoration as a service to customers that depend on the tourism, coastal protection, fisheries benefits of reefs. So insurers, developers, governments, hotels, cruise lines, corporate sponsors, to unlock funding to do ecosystem scale restoration. And then our farms are based primarily on land. So in addition to being able to work our magic, growing them faster, making them stronger, the coral farms act as education centers for local communities as well as revenue generating tourism attractions. And then finally, whether through brand partnerships or people going online and adopting corals, there's a whole sort of digital side of how we then are able to generate sustainable funding to do the much needed ecosystem scale restoration rather than being reliant on simply grants and donations as has existed for the past few decades.
Very cool. We talked a little bit with Olv about the importance of reefs and how much they are degraded, and that protection can help take away some of the human impacts, then human innovation on top of that. What do you see as the combination between doing less harm and doing more good, and how we get to that scale?
We need them both. I mean, as I'm sure Ove said earlier, I mean, he's one of the most brilliant coral scientists that's around, and will agree with pretty much everyone on this front. We urgently need large-scale restoration. We need people to fund it. We need technologists to come on board, engineers. It's not just something that's for the coral community and local communities. At the same time, restoration is not a silver bullet. The best thing to do for coral reefs is to stop killing them, which is why here at COP we need our leaders in industry and government and the media to step up and solve for climate change, habitat destruction, pollution, overfishing. But in particular with coral reefs, one of the things that's killing them is warming oceans. And let's just hope that we are able to get to carbon neutrality, but even 1.5, which again isn't going to happen tomorrow. If we achieve that, the ocean's still going to keep warming. Corals are going to keep dying for decades, and so we need to urgently fund and implement restoration and adaptation solutions. So we need to do less harm while we also do more good, and I think scale is the key challenge that's held back that type of thing from happening, and that's what we at Coral Reef are really trying to address, is teaming up with scientists, community members, the private sector, governments, local communities to create this global network to scale restoration so that future generations can still have thriving coral reefs. And to do that hand in hand with marine protected areas, to do that with other innovative solutions, and there's this real opportunity, in particular before, but now being part of the whole Earthshot Prize community, to really explore all these synergies, but people working together and how we're all on the same team to solve these things together.
For sure, that's great. Yeah, we need system changers for system change, right? Yvonne mentioned that there's been this degradation of natural capital, which we've mentioned, and this under leverage and under potential of social capital. And you've been working a lot with the Bahamian communities. And I think one of the things about this kind of work is how place-based it is, right? Our ecosystems are unique, our cultures are unique. Can you talk a little bit about the local communities?
Sure. One of the most important parts of the equation that needs to be counted by everyone. I'm not Bahamian. I didn't grow up on these coral reefs. They're not the reefs I depend on. And we have to consider how not only should locals be included in all these types of environmental projects, but the projects are also more successful if you do so. So whether it's employing locals as much as possible, half of our staff and growing is Bahamian for our first coral farms, using the farms as education centers for everyone from students to fishermen to government ministers, to also, not something I expected to happen, but we were there during Hurricane Dorian, and our farm had 17 feet of water. The farm damage aside, the community needed help, and so we used all of our platform, our resources, our team to just do rescue, relief, rebuilding work for the next few months. And we saw how coral reefs and mangrove forests literally save people's lives because they slowed down storm surge for people to get to higher ground, to get to the second floor of their house or to go to their neighbors' houses. And so putting aside experiencing the climate crisis on the front line with these people, with the Bahamian people, there's also, it sort of made us double down our commitment to them and to all the places we intend to work, because we have a much better chance of succeeding and have the opportunity to learn from traditional knowledge and empower, create real meaningful jobs and economic opportunities and better fish catches and all that stuff if we're working hand in hand with the community. So that's core to our model, and one of the things I love most about my job.
That's awesome. How can the Julius Baer community help you?
We want to launch farms in countries all around the world, so whether there are connections to people on the ground that can help with local partnerships, looking at project finance as a means to help fund restoration projects. There's all sorts of exciting things coming online in conservation financing that we're looking to tap into. We signed our first restoration contracts earlier this year with the Bahamian government and the Grand Bahama Port Authority, which is really exciting, and looking at the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. And then we will be investing, not only the local communities, but also, raising investment rounds in the future. So we just raised a $2 million seed round to transform our pilot to a state-of-the-art facility. I'm sure there will be a Series A in the not too distant future. But thinking about from the government regulatory side, connections to other island nations or coastal nations, to project finance and our eventual investment needs, I think the blue economy and the restoration economy is a really, really exciting space that hopefully everyone will be looking towards, not only as a good opportunity from a financial lens, but also a real opportunity to make an impact, and then give everyone in the community an excuse to come to the Bahamas and plant some coral with us.
That's great. Thank you, Sam, for all your work and innovation on every level, including on the financing side, which is going to take us to our next speaker, Matthew McClookie from Poseidon, who is the managing director, to talk about how we pay for this transition to a coral reef economy. Welcome, Matt. How do financial markets innovate to support this transition?
Thanks, Kristen. Well, I think what capital markets are starting to realize off of the back of huge advancements in science and technology that have really shone a bright spotlight on the oceans and what's beneath the surface, markets are starting to realize the immense economic value that the blue economy and coral reef ecosystems as part of that can offer. And when we look at that offering, it's not only in terms of financial gain, but also impact gains as part of a responsible investor approach within an investment mandate. If we look at the economic value of the goods and services provided by coral reefs around the world, science has put that value at around $375 billion of calculable value. If we added up the incalculable value, then it's going to be many multiples of that. And that value gets spread across not only the sovereign perspective, so coral reefs for particular coastal states and small island states can form the backbone of sovereign creditworthiness, enable those states to go out to markets and raise money, but also they form the backbone of many corporates around the world who rely on healthy ecosystems, healthy marine coral reef systems to actually operate as functional businesses. But what we've seen conversely is that the amount of funding which has been mobilized for the conservation of coral reefs has paled into significance for what is actually required. Between 2010 and 2016, the markets only raised about $1.9 billion toward direct coral reef conservation. We need to be talking about many, many magnitudes of that. Now, the good news is that actually the blue economy and coral reefs within them offer probably the most exciting area of environmental finance globally to date. We've seen incredible innovation in the development of financial instruments for the preservation of these unique natural assets. From the sovereign side, we've seen a number of interesting debt for nature swaps, the Seychelles, but most recently Belize, where these sovereign states have actually converted some of their international debt liability into a commitment to protect coral reef ecosystems, but also finance them into perpetuity with innovative endowments and other types of financing mechanisms. We've seen the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, which is committing over $500 million to these unique ecosystems across blended finance, private equity, and other forms of funding for the private sector actors to actually be able to work from the ground up to conserve these unique habitats. We've seen interesting insurance products linked to coral reefs, and fundamentally the private sector actors who are developing business models, from Coral Vita regenerating coral farms to fisheries businesses, aquaculture, algae, seaweed. We're seeing a number of very interesting innovations. And what does that mean for investors? Well, investors can actually generate a performance alpha from the arbitrage that gets created through companies that are utilizing these resources more sustainably in their business models relative to those that aren't. Very simply, if you're a fishing business and there are less fish within your ecosystem, your costs of extracting the existing population go up, but your underlying business model gets compromised. And so what we're really pushing for is we're pushing for a strong efficiency thesis. And so what does that mean? At a corporate level, it's about governance, it's about policy setting, it's about management teams of businesses actually embracing a transition towards a much more sustainable blue economy and really gearing that up with committed finance that can be applied across the supply chain and value chain towards conserving these habitats. That then carries downstream towards more efficient production. That can be looking at how the companies are actually physically producing goods and services around coral reefs, what input factors they have, and also how they're managing waste to ensure that we aren't actually polluting the seas where coral reefs are that are already exposed to the challenges of climate change. And next we look at habitat management, and working with local communities is crucial to managing the habitats of coral reefs. Communities who are most dependent on maintaining healthy reef systems are really their custodians. And I think corporate engagement and partnership with communities, but also with governments who set policies that really have an impact on communities, is something that we would heavily advocate for in advancing discussions with investors in these businesses. So I think the final point is really that. We can see a direct correlation between the material impact indicators of coral reef health and resilience and corporate performance and value. And so with that in mind, we really encourage further exploration from the capital markets as a whole, both across investors, across asset managers, across the insurance sector, across policymakers, to really make sure that as the market system, we're supporting coral reef resilience and we're supporting the communities that fundamentally depend on these unique habitats.
That is a very comprehensive answer. Thank you so much, Matt. Well, we really appreciate Matt, Sam, and Ove sharing their terrific insights with us today. We've had a lot of fun this week at the Climate COP, making sure the blue economy is front and center of climate discussions. And circulating around this week has been this wonderful plan to save the world's coral reefs, which is a pamphlet and a new report that has been going to policymakers this week from a consortium of reef experts, and we will be sending that to you as follow-up from Julius Baer after this webinar, along with some other resources for you, because you too can be part of this solution and increasing the prosperity of our coral reefs and making sure that it is a victory of the commons instead of tragedy of the commons for our ocean, with a positive ocean economy. So thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.